Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. So nice of you to join us and spend a couple of hours with us this evening. We really appreciate that. If you get a chance, check out the YouTube channel as well and subscribe if you like. There's tons of other shows there that we have already sort of put in the can, but they're fascinating interviews and lots of fun, very informative, and it's an exciting group of material that we have covered. I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing introduction. As always, you can find him at nativestorytellers.com. He is an amazing storyteller. It is their way of preserving history, and far better than our history books, because actually they weave the truth into what they're talking about, as opposed to some of the books that our children have to learn from. Tonight I have a cool lady here. I have Varla Ventura with me tonight, and she's the author of many books. Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, Ghost Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings. She's also the author of 5 other books on spooky stuff: Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, the Book of the Bizarre, along with the Mermaids, Fairies, Pookas and Changelings, and she can often be found lurking about in the deep, dark woods and lakes of Minnesota on the hunt for beastly things and hidden history, along with the elusive little man of legend as well. Her topics are fascinating, and I actually learned a lot from all of this, and I think you're going to learn a lot from her too. So welcome to the show, Varla. I'm really glad that you're here tonight. Finally, we get to do a show.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, you have picked topics that, as a group, it's a very unusual. It is a potpourri of the paranormal for sure, but it's material that one wouldn't think that somebody would delve into the way you have delved, and your books are fascinating. They are enlightening in many different ways. How did you ever fall into this pathway?
It's funny because I can't imagine it doing them any other way. I think I was sort of born into an environment that fostered my belief in paranormal, in sort of the other realms of possibility, fairies. My mother's a wonderful storyteller and would read Grimm's fairy tales to us at night, would make up these wonderfully extravagant tales. And also, on her bookshelf, you would find collections of ghost stories, and you would find things about the Kabbalah and there'd be an Aleister Crowley book. There'd be tarot, different tarot volumes. And so I think from a young age, these were sort of things that I was exposed to. Other people are exposed to things like going to Sunday school. That was not the case for me. Quite the opposite, really. And I think, and I do believe, and they say this about, children learning languages, or when you learn a language, that, a kid that is exposed to another language, and children that are taught a second language under the age of 10, they absorb it in a different way, and they sort of never forget. There's certain things they'll never forget about it, and it's then therefore easier to go on and become bilingual or trilingual. And I think that that's true also of the kinds of spirituality that you can be exposed to. And for me, I was exposed to things like lucid dreaming at a very young age, herbal wisdom, and those sorts of things stuck with me. Not that I had a full comprehension of those things at, under the age of 10, or really, quite frankly, under the age of 20. But I think that there were, well, maybe even 30, but there's a sort of a foundation there that kind of led me down this path of exploring dark folklore and the bizarre with such gusto.
Well, I think your mother had to have been, and is, a rather amazing lady, because she exposed you to all of this and didn't make it frightening or anything like that. It was just, this is very natural, and this is something that happens, and it's no big deal. It's, this is another part of life. And you weren't turned on or frightened by any of this. It doesn't feel like you hid under the bed for a couple of years or anything like that. And yet, you have a working knowledge of a lot of very unusual paranormal people, certainly werewolves and vampires and changelings, and of course all of the elementals and the wee folk. But it's spectacular that your mother gave you this exposure so that you were comfortable with it, so that you were able to, embrace it and enjoy it, and not be terrified by it. It's really,
I do think that's something that happens by default with parents and children, right? That they pass those fears on. And when your child says, I think there's something under my bed or something in my closet, people want to alleviate those fears by shutting them down. But often that actually does quite the opposite. It invalidates those fears and invalidates the fact that maybe you did see something hovering there, and now you see it again and you feel like you can't talk about it. And I think I hear of, I listen a lot to, I love Jim Harold's campfire stories, where people call in and they talk about these paranormal experiences they've had. And it's just really fun to listen to late at night, can't sleep, you'll get freaked out, but it's great. And so, there have been a few times I've listened to it and I thought, I actually can't sleep now. But what I hear again and again are these stories of people, everyday people who have had an experience where they have seen a ghost, heard a ghost, repeatedly had a haunting in their house. And so many times they are afraid, they're almost more afraid to talk about it than they are actually afraid in that moment. And that can often be brought back to it being sort of dismissed when they were young, the whole concept being dismissed, or a specific incident being dismissed as imaginary. And so I do think that I was very fortunate in that, these things were not, I was never made to fear them. I don't feel that they were pushed upon me. It wasn't like I was, sat down and, my mother smudged me every every solstice or anything like that. But I mean, I had a working knowledge of a lot of the probably things that would be considered the occult arts just by nature of, what you're surrounded, what your family surrounds you with. And anyway, at that age. But I do feel very fortunate that I was raised to not fear those things, because I think it did create a foundation, a little bit of a foundation of a, obsession and interest in things of maybe what might be considered the dark side. But certainly, it gave me a foundation of the feeling that I could explore those things without that fear. Not that I haven't had a few occasions when I've been afraid. I'm not saying that I'm, the toughest person on earth, but it does take a lot to scare me. And a lot of times the things that really scare me have nothing to do with the paranormal, right? They have to do with what you read on the daily news. So.
Well, you grew up in a household that was very accepting of all of this stuff, and I think every household should be. But I think the cool thing is, now you've written 4 books that I ate up, and I have to tell you, I learned a lot, and in a way you kind of I apparently have been wrongly illusioned, because in all of the different areas that you went into, werewolves and vampires and changelings and ghosts and little men, elves, gnomes, leprechauns, tree spirits, and pookas and mermaids. I mean, in all of these stories, first of all, in your books, you give a history. You give a little bit of outline of what these creatures were and what their, kind of what their realms were that they operated in, and then you went into some of the fables and stories that are out there about them, and they're fascinating books. They are so much fun to read. But I found that my illusions, especially about fairies, were destroyed. I mean, they aren't the they aren't the little fairy princesses with the wands that grant your wishes, and that was kind of like, oh no. Actually, it's really kind of interesting. I had Gary Wayne on the show a while back, and he went into a lot of these elementals and fairies and changelings as well, and they're all in the Bible, most of them, and none of them are happy campers. They really, they aren't out to destroy humanity, but they aren't exactly out to do good and leave cookies on your pillow at night either. So aren't there any good fairies?
Bring back the illusion, Varla. Yeah, there are. There definitely are. There are many wonderful, helpful fairy spirits out there. Absolutely. But I will say that, my aim was not to really I think there's a lot of discussion about the sort of sweeter fairies and the sweeter mermaids. And my aim was to actually sort of shed some light on this, sort of just paint the picture of the fairy kingdom, much as it was painted once upon a time, 200 years ago in Ireland, or 500 years ago in the United States. The sort of relationship that people had with these creatures was not always, hey, how you doing? Help my garden. There are garden fairies. They do like when you tend the garden, when you care for it, they will help you. There's the wonderful community of Findhorn, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was this, place in Scotland where by making offerings and working with the elementals, they were able to grow, massive cabbages and all these incredible plants that were much bigger than ever anticipated, and thriving in soil that once nothing could thrive. And so that shows you that by, just by nature of working with fairies, you can actually have a lot of harmony, and they can bring good things into your life. But one must tread very carefully in this kingdom, because it is not all a kingdom of light and sparkles. It really isn't. There are a lot of potholes you can twist your ankle in, and rabbit holes you can fall down, and potions that you can accidentally sip, and wild, ghoulish rides that you can be taken upon, on a midnight, on a dark and stormy night. I mean, there are many different types of, and that's the other thing too, is when we get to fairies, we have this, like the kingdom of fairy, and I think of it the way that you might think of a plant kingdom, or the kingdom of fungi. It's like you've got all of these different types of fungus underneath this, in this kingdom, and they're also kind of considered part of the plant kingdom, but they're their own kingdom. And fairies are sort of like that. They're not quite human, not quite ghosts. They straddle this other realm that is ever present and yet invisible. So it can be very maddening. And there are a lot of dark and menacing things, just as there are in the dark of the forest. There are many things that can harm you, or that may not necessarily wish you harm, but aren't necessarily there to lend a hand. And there's a lot of trickery.
Yeah. I know that when I moved to where I live now, my thing was I wanted to make gardens, and there was nothing here. And so, part of the reason I bought the house was because it had a blank yard, and so I immediately tore it apart, and I put garden beds in there, and I would be out late at night, and I would be talking to the little people or the fairies or whoever was there, and it was like, look, you guys, I need help, because I didn't realize I was built on a gravel pit. So there's really no soil here, but that doesn't mean we still can't have a great garden. And I talked, people thought I was crazy, but I was constantly talking to the plants and talking to the whoever was there to help. And I have a garden that is just the most beautiful thing you ever saw, and it's not just because I was out there. There was help for sure, and because it is a gravel pit. There is no soil.
And you absolutely, that is probably the best relationship that humans have with fairies, is in nature and in the cultivation of nature in the garden. Fairies like that. They like to have a sanctuary. They like to have an oasis, and they like being asked for help. There are also a lot of domestic fairies that will help you with things like housework, or making sure that your animals are safe at night and protected from, wild beasts and things like that. But it comes with a price, and that price is that you must, there has to be a level of respect, and there generally has to be some kind of offering, something given to them that is more than a trifling. Now, that could be your own blood, sweat, and tears. But usually they like shiny things, too. So you can leave some shiny things out there. But there's a lot of really fun and interesting stories about, like, fairies kind of tidying up a kitchen, and then one day the girl who usually cleans the kitchen is lazy, and she wakes up with, black and blue marks, and she's got, pinch marks all over her, and the kitchen's all awry again. Because she got lazy and just expected this house brownie to do all the work for her. So
is that kind of like in Harry Potter with the house? I forget what they were called, but they had house.
Yes, actually, it's the Dobby, right? I think in Harry Potter, it's called Dobby, and actually in Scotland, that's the word. It's Dobby or Dobie, depending on how you read it. It's spelled a little differently. It's Dobie in most of the instances that I've seen, but it's absolutely something I love, and I loved this about doing the research for my fairy book, or that there were so many, there was this incredible linguistic connection between different creatures. So Dobby and hobgoblin and goblins and bogies and all of these things, they're sort of little words that mean one thing in Gaelic, that means something else in English, and they sort of all can describe a very similar creature, or a creature that might have similar attributes, maybe not necessarily physically the same, but you've got, your trolls, and then you've got your dwarves, and you've got your goblins. And in some cases, most of the time, we think of goblins as being these very mischievous and somewhat mean or even evil creatures. But in a lot of cases, when we refer to a hobgoblin or a hopgoblin, and eventually the hop and the hob were taken off, we're talking about something that's also known in Wales as a brownie, and is known in Scotland as a dobby or a dobie. And those are these little, 3-foot-high house spirits who help and who look after things and who like cats and who sort of, and some people even believe that cats would transform into these things and help hunt the mice and protect the grain and all of these kinds of very positive relationships. But you couldn't abuse them, and you couldn't take advantage of them. And, if they didn't like you, there wasn't a lot you could do. I mean, if they're in your house, they're in your house.
Oh, yeah.
So, but I found that very interesting because, we think of some of the words that we use, and I think that most people, when they say fairy, they immediately get sort of a Tinkerbell-like image in their head. And that's not entirely, there's an aspect of the fairy kingdom. When J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan, he, that was in the late 1800s in England, and he was well-versed it was Victorian times, right? So he was well-versed in folklore and tales of the little people. So there's a lot of elements of that made their way eventually to what we look at in modern culture. But I thank God for J.K. Rowling, because she really took it all. She took that and she just elevated it in a much truer way. Not that I'm not saying all those things are true, but she drew upon these dark elements and these light elements and these elements of magic and folklore, and kind of brought them back in the proper way, so they weren't so glazed over and shiny and preserved inside a snow globe. They were like dripping and oozing under the door. So it's nice. I'm glad.
Do you think that at some point in time in our history, way back, there was a time where they were all very much more a part of our reality, and that there was a shift at some point in time where they kind of went a half dimension away? And because I truly believe there was a time where we could talk to animals. I truly believe that there was a time in our history of evolution. Forget what the books say. I really believe that humanity had a period of time where we could talk to the animals and they could talk back to us. I mean, I'm an animal communicator now, so I do some of that, but they literally would talk to us, and we would be able to talk to them. And the element of the fairies, gnomes, and elves and changelings, and maybe even vampires, mermaids, and most of them were a part of the reality as well, and we lived in harmony.
Well, and there certainly was fear as well. There was harmony and fear feeding together. But I do agree with that, because I do think that there was a time when we also had to rely very much, and this was a time when things like fertility rituals or a big bonfire when you're donning skins and you're dancing around the fire and you're trying to sort of transform into something wild in order to ask for the help and the protection of those wild things, to protect your family, to protect your people, to protect your crops. Those things were very vital. And I think it's interesting because one of our most famous collectors of folklore, William Butler Yeats, and I know that Mark loves him. We've talked about him before. He actually, and I have the utmost respect for his work and what he set out to do to a certain extent, but I do think that he came from a place of a little bit of disbelief, and also the idea that he was more educated than the people who were telling these stories. And so therefore, these were the old stories of the peasants, rather than these were the authentic indigenous stories. And so I think that happened again and again and again, and was put into, written English, which is what we in the Western world are exposed to most of the time. And we don't have those kind of we don't have the experience of having somebody tell us firsthand or third hand or tell the tales. And I think there's a whole other thing about storytelling that I know we can talk about, but I do think that there was a time when you had to be more in tune with your environment in order to survive. And by being more in tune with your environment, you're more inclined to recognize, one, there are things out there you absolutely do not know and you cannot reconcile. You will hear strange noises in the night. You can tell yourself that's a wild cat, but you know in your heart it's not. And
no, that's true.
And I think you also had to give it up a little more. Okay, these are the things that we need to give respect to, because, whether you're all in or not, your livelihood is on the line. And as we became more industrialized, we became further away from that.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that we are getting back to that time frame when I moved up here. Somebody sent me, and I don't remember who, they sent me a fairy house made, of leaves and moss and, smoke stuff, and it has a doorway, and the directions were to hang it facing the garden and to never put your finger in it. And it's been hanging there. It has been hanging in my kitchen for 15 years. It will go with me when I move. And I had a friend up here, a number of years ago, and there were raccoons out on the deck, and she was it was nighttime, and she was trying to take a picture through the window, and every time she aimed at the raccoon, her screen just filled up with kind of like a ball of light, fuzzy light. And she said, that's so weird. She said, I can point it anywhere else, but when I point it at the window, it gets all kind of like fuzzy. And I said, well, and she said, what do you suppose is going on here? And I said, well, you're right by the fairy house. I think the fairy probably wants her picture taken. And once you take the picture, ask her to get out of the way. And so she looked at me, and I said, I'm telling you, take a picture of the fairy house and the fairy. And so she took a picture of the fairy house and the fairy, and then I said, and ask her. And she asked the fairy nicely. And I said, okay, now take your shot. And she went, oh, my God, I can now take, it's gone. I can take a picture of the raccoons. And, I tell people it's a fairy house. They kind of look at me strangely, and it's like I said, do not put your hand in there. But she's been with me for 15 years. So, I'm not sure how she's going to like the move, but,
just maybe make sure she's facing an even more beautiful garden, and
she's going to have to do
put
something
some
for her
whiskey
for
in
sure.
there. put some good bourbon in there, maybe.
I'm not sure she's a drinker.
Yeah. Well, you never know.
Sweet things, cookies I can see, but one of the other things that I wanted that fascinated me, because I didn't know a lot about them, were the Banshees. And
now Banshees are scary in many ways, and they are fascinating.
I love them. I love them especially because apparently it only happens, you have to have a family banshee. You can't just have a random banshee, or can you?
Well, so banshees are great because just quickly in case people aren't familiar with, because I think a lot of people have heard terms like scream like a banshee or perhaps even have the drink a screaming banshee. But what a banshee is just by definition, and the word banshee, it comes from Banse, which is basically of the fairy mound. If I totally butchered the Gaelic there. But it essentially is a fairy creature, but it also seems to really straddle the world of ghosts more than any other fairy creature that I have ever read about or studied or encountered myself. The banshees really kind of straddle both those worlds, and that became incredibly fascinating to me because they are essentially a portent of death. So traditionally, a banshee would appear and warn you of either grave illness or an imminent death, usually of someone within your family or a very small, if you lived in a small village, someone within that group. The idea of having a banshee as a family banshee, as something that you would inherit, kind of goes back to the original kings of Ireland and the original clans of Ireland. A banshee, by definition, is Irish. There are counterparts to the banshee around the world and similar banshee-like beings around the world, but the word itself is used to define the Irish banshee. I'm not saying you can't have a banshee experience elsewhere, but that's the traditional definition that it came from the fairy mound. And so originally, of course, there were these, clans in Ireland, and they would have their houses, and the houses would have a haunting or a banshee that would haunt them. And so that's the other thing, is that banshees are often referred to as haunting a family, although they're not a ghost. You will find in other parts of the world, Italy especially, throughout Europe, you'll find, and Central and South America as well, you will find instances of something that's more like a ghost. Often it's a woman in white, La Llorona, seen wandering along the highway, sobbing and crying. But the banshee is associated with that banshee scream, that high-pitched wailing sound that, if you've ever experienced or heard of Irish keening, which is a way of mourning, it's a incredibly powerful song that is also wrought with pain and sorrow. And I've always imagined that a banshee would sound much like that, like a person in very, very deep mourning. And in fact, banshees are thought to have been either women who died in childbirth, women who lost their children young, and then now spend, eternity sort of roaming and warning people when death is coming to them. That's very common that you'll hear that. And you hear that also with, like, the story of La Llorona, which has kind of been circulating. I think there was a movie out recently, which I have yet to see, about the legend of La Llorona, which is essentially in Mexico, very similar. It's a woman with all long black hair who is thought to have either drowned her children or have died in childbirth, and is seen alongside highways and sometimes gets in somebody's car, and it can often be considered a curse. A banshee doesn't exactly curse people. She just sort of reveals the inevitable. And that's what's so scary about a banshee, because it's not even you. It's not like she shows up and you're going to die. It's not the cloaked hood of death. It's like someone you love, which is worse. That's way worse. Because if you're going to die, it's just like, okay, that's what can you do? But, someone knowing that you're going to lose someone that you love or care about, is, that can be this whole other challenge. So that is very scary. But sometimes it's not always death. Sometimes it is, just illness or a warning of another kind that's very severe.
But weren't there two kinds of banshees? One that was, loud, raucous, and frightening, and then there was a banshee, almost like a gentle banshee. If the person who was going to pass was a good person and a loving person and a compassionate person, it wasn't so much a scream as it was a song.
In most of the stories that I have read and most of the stories that I've been told about banshees, it's almost always a terrifying wail. But that's not, I mean, I don't know all of them. You know, there's stories all around the world of, you know, counterparts of the banshee. Now, it's interesting that you bring that up because that puts the banshee a little bit more in the category of something like a psychopomp, which would be something that sort of guides you on to death, which I actually often think of mermaids in that way, that they are the psychopomps of the sea and that they assist people who are drowning at sea to have a gentle passage. But with banshees, they don't always appear they're not always necessarily at the deathbed so much as warning someone who's living that death is nigh. There are different degrees of banshees. Most of them are not malevolent. Most of them are just sort of, you know, you almost get the impression that they're trapped and they're just doing their duty. But there are stories of banshees who perhaps they don't feel that their message is being heard, and they will whip through your house like a wild, cold wind and shatter all of your china and upset all of your teacups and wreak havoc and just sort of tatter your curtains like as if a hurricane were coming through. So sometimes there are stories of that as well. But just kind of going back to the, like, whether a family, I mean, traditionally a family would sort of inherit this banshee. But here's the thing I've never been sure of. Did the family inherit the banshee, or did the family inherit the ability to see the banshee? Because it can skip a generation. And that's true of the second sight, the ability to see fairies and commune with fairies. And we see that all the time with people with psychic abilities and, people who understand the paranormal and have had more paranormal encounters, sensitives. You'll hear time and time again, I'm sure you've heard this many times, well, my grandmother used to read cards, or or things like that where it might skip a generation. So sometimes I wonder when I read those stories about, this family ghost, I wonder, does every single person really see it? No. But a lot of people will accept it without seeing it. That's not necessarily saying they're dismissing it, but the ability to see it, I think, comes down to a certain set of skills that you're born with, just like some people are really, really amazing artists naturally, and some people have incredible voices, and other people have a natural ability to see what other people can't see. Fairies, ghosts, other things slithering through the night. Shall remain nameless.
Yeah, I don't like the slithery things. Well, they were saying, you said in the book, I believe that if it was a family banshee, sometimes even when people were at war, the banshee knew when somebody was going to pass or die, and even though the person may have been hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away, they still knew it was going to happen, and they did their wailing.
Yes, and they would sort of appear to the family, and that's how they would know that person had passed, or know that they were going to get the letter the next day, or someone was going to show up at the doorstep the next day. And you also do have instances of people sort of. So I've had a few modern tales since I wrote this book. I've had some people share stories with me, and time and again, not super frequently, but every now and again, there will be a story of a disembodied head. And I'm not not saying that head is floating around, but right after I wrote this book, I was on a show and someone called in, or actually I think wrote to me and said, I'm going to tell you something, and can you tell me, what you think about this? Because when you were talking about Banshees and you're describing Banshees, it sounded like that to me. Oh, and the other thing about Banshees that's kind of interesting is they do have a little bit of a shape-shifting quality, and they can appear beautiful or like a little old lady who's sort of, walking down the road innocently, hobbling and carrying something, and then when you reach them and say, oh, excuse me, ma'am, can I carry your basket? Or when you open the door, they can transform into something very like horrifying and frightening. And they are certainly meant to scare you. I don't think that they're not meant to scare you, but I think that's a way of kind of getting their message across and getting that attention. But going back to the disembodied head, so anyway, this person wrote to me, said, so what I had, and it always stood out in my mind, he said, I have something, he heard it and saw it, and his cousin only heard it but didn't see it at first. And that's another thing about Banshees, is that some people only hear it. Some people can hear and see it. So sometimes you'll hear it in the distance, or you'll hear it and you'll know what it was. But there are people that, go the next level and actually witness and see one. So that was kind of interesting to me. And he said that it was this wailing noise, but it was just a head. It was just a head floating there. There wasn't a whole kind of like creature body. And they didn't remember exactly what it, all the details of exactly what it looked like. And this was years ago when he told me the story. So I've lost a little of it in translation, I'm sure. But essentially, this thing transformed, screaming, and they both ended up being able to see it and never were able to figure out what it was. So my question, immediately was like, was there something that happened after that? Like, was that a turning point? Was there someone that passed away? And we kind of corresponded about it back and forth a little bit. But then years later, when I was actually researching the fairy book, I found another story about a disembodied head kind of ghosty thing that appeared at the crossroads in a book called what is that book called? It's by this man named William Wirt Sykes, and it's all about, it's like fairies and bogies of Wales or something like that. And it was written a long time ago, and it's very thick with language, but there's these incredible stories in there that he tells, sort of the traditional. He was a consulate who lived in Wales, and he was, I believe he was American, and he was the American consulate in Wales in the late 1800s, and he was so fascinated with all of these old stories, and he was like living in New York or something like that, and so he started recording these stories kind of in the way that the Grimm's brothers did and William Butler Yeats did, only William Wirt Sykes was a little bit more of a he was a little more interested in the culture and a little more fascinated with it, and a little less he seemed a little more prone to believe it, I guess. So he tells this story about these sort of like bogies at the crossroads that would appear, and they were these disembodied heads. Also tied in with this corpse candle flickering light that indicated imminent death, so there were some similarities in those stories. Now, the guy who told me the story, that happened in the United States. So I think just kind of going back to what we were talking about in the very beginning with the fairy kingdom and the way that you might describe something and have a name for it, but then it has the attributes of something else that has a different name and a different appearance, but that sort of serves the same purpose in the I guess like the structure of the folklore. And you see these kind of things, and you just sort of realize it's such a vast kingdom, and everywhere there are variants. And so after spending 4 years researching a book, the minute it goes to press, somebody calls me with a story I've never heard before. And I've gone to Ireland. I'm actually going to Ireland again this summer. I'm so excited because it's been a while since I've been back there, and this time I'm bringing my son, and so that will be kind of a different experience to travel through Ireland and gather more stories and hear. I mean, like every time you hear something you've never heard before, and it just kind of makes you realize that there's so many layers to it that you could study it, you could spend your whole life studying it and really probably never really be able to, like if anybody ever puts out like a complete volume of creatures in the fairy kingdom, they're lying, because there's no way you could, because by nature of being fairies, they're going to trick you into thinking and then I lost a whole chapter in my book to a hobgoblin or something. And I woke up in the morning and the chapter was gone. And I thought, I must have just been working late at night, and I copied and pasted over it, and I lost it. And, I'm no stranger to word processing programs, and so I did every bit of recovery I could do, and I could never recover this chapter. So I had to kind of rewrite it. But when I rewrote it, it became completely different. And it was a chapter on hobgoblins. So playing tricks.
That has happened.
So I just thought
that has happened. That's happened to me as well. And it.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of like it's kind of like, all right, so what I had written was not appropriate. Now I have to go back and try again. And when you realize that that's what's going on, that something is saying, that wasn't right, or that wasn't good enough, or I didn't feel like letting you do it. So but it does spur you on to greater things for sure.
Well, it was humbling, definitely. It was definitely humbling because it was like, here I was thinking, I'm about to hit my deadline and everything's going well and I've done all my research, and they're like, yeah, you're like 20,000 words short, lady.
You have another entity that when I heard the name, all I could think of was what a great name for a cat, and it was Pooka. And then I read about what Pookas were, and I decided it's a great name for a cat, but Pookas aren't exactly cuddly.
Well, they are shapeshifters, though. I mean, they are usually they come in animal form, and they're very tricky. So, a little trickster black cat, actually, I could see being called Pooka. I had one that I used to call Pookie, but that was for other reasons. But yes, Pookas are. I love Pookas. I think Pookas are the one you'd probably want to actually. I don't know that you'd want to encounter them willingly, but if you had to run into a creature at the crossroads late at night from the fairy kingdom, a Pooka would not be the worst thing, because they really represent that trickster element. So they love to prey on sort of the vulnerable, in that they like, okay, so for example, town drunks are often the target for Pookas because nobody ever believes the town drunk. And you see this in Harvey with Jimmy Stewart. He's Elwood P's out and he's talking to this giant rabbit, and that's his Pooka. That was my first exposure to a Pooka, was that movie. And I thought, it's a funny movie, and Jimmy Stewart, he's just wonderful in it. But he's also the drunk, and he kind of embarrasses his sister, but he doesn't care. He's just talking to this Pooka. And you think the Pooka's there, and he thinks the Pooka's there. But then, you'll see the scene pull back, and he's talking to an empty bar stool. This is what Pookas are known for. They're known for tricking someone. They're known for appearing when no one else can verify that you've seen them, usually when you're stumbling home late along a path that you probably shouldn't have taken, the shortcut by the cliff, when you really should have just gone the long way, and you should have left the pub an hour before that anyway. So the puka just, puka will come along and sort of sweep you up. Pukas can appear as rabbits. They can appear as horses. Very frequently, they're described as horses, usually black horses with glowing red eyes. Occasionally, other creatures. Sometimes you see something a little more dog-like or a little more cat-like, but usually, and even a bird once in a while. But most often, you have a rabbit or a horse. And the horse will take you for this wild ride. Very rarely will cause death. But death is usually only because somebody is like driven mad and they leap off a cliff or fall down a cliff or something. It's not usually a trying to hurt you in that way. But I thought a lot about pukas and why would they appear at this time and what do they represent. And I really think that they exist to shake you out of your own ignorance or stupidity, and like you are literally on the wrong path. You are going the wrong way. You are doing the wrong thing, and I'm going to scare you so much that you're going to start doing the right thing because you're going to wake up in a ditch and say, I don't know, it was the puka. So you hear the puka is also sort of, a great excuse for anyone who stays out a little late and couldn't find their way home. So I have thought about the puka and why is the puka so significant, and why is the puka significant in early Irish folklore especially. And there is this idea. There was certainly a lot of when paganism became not the norm in Ireland and Catholicism began to take root, a lot of the traditional stories were sort of, shoved down in the ground and with a nice church built on top of them. And yet these creatures continued to rise. And so again and again in Irish folklore you have, it's not only in Irish folklore, but in Irish folklore in particular, there's this unique and incredibly rich tradition of a strong belief in the fairy world, in the other world, that is not in conflict with the teachings of the church, which so many times you see this it's black or white. You can't believe in fairies and believe in God. And that's not the case at all. In fact, you're a fool if you think that, really. In Ireland, it's much more ingrained in the culture in a normal way. Of course, there are people with all varying beliefs throughout, it's a generalization. But I think you do find this idea that you were supposed to, at a certain point, you were supposed to be more pious. You were supposed to not stay out too late on Saturday so you could get to church on Sunday. And so a lot of these traditional preachers could be used in humorous ways to tell the story of, Jimmy O'Toole who fell down the path by the sea again. Last I saw him, he was at the pub, coming on midnight, and he was supposed to be going home. So there's this wonderful other element to it that brings it into kind of more modern times. And I think really good stories can do that. They can take traditions and roll with them, but also stay true to them somehow. And I feel like the puka is just as appropriate today as it ever was.
Well, I just fell in love with the name and the reality of what they are. I think that these are. It's another level, another layer, another element of our reality that so many people tend to ignore or negate, and it adds such a wonderful richness to our lives if you realize that they're actually there. And you're not going to trip over them, though you might, but they
might trip you, right?
Exactly. how many of us have tripped over nothing? Our shadows, It's like, I know there was something there. It must have been because I tripped over it. But I think that so many of us have become so anchored to the physical reality that we are ignoring, what is there, just a little bit, dimensionally a little off, that is really there. How many of us have actually seen something out of the corner of our eye and turned and it was not there? I mean, just about everybody has experienced that. Of course, every time I say something like that, then everybody looks at me and says, "Well, I haven't, and I haven't, and I haven't." But so often out of the corner,
they go home and they're looking over their shoulder.
Yeah, I mean, so it happens to me now. I have in my house. My house is a really clear house as far as energy goes, but I do have a cat, a ghost cat, and his name is Smudge, and he was my cat, and he passed away here, and he is here, and I can say easily a dozen people or more have seen him. He absolutely manifests as a solid cat, and he'll brush up against you, and you'll look, and there's nothing there. Aww. There's no one there, but you knew there was a gray cat there, and it's. And I tell people that there is a cat here. There are 3 cats that are real, but there is a solid gray cat, and his name is Smudge, and he will definitely let you know he's here. And so many people who did not believe me became believers real fast when he rubbed up against them. So I think that people are missing a richness in their life to not be aware of these other levels of reality that are truly a part of us that we don't pay any attention to, unfortunately. The garden stuff, I'm a garden person. When I was looking for houses, at first I was looking for yards that I could plant it, and then I realized I created such a big garden here I can't take care of it anymore. So it's kind of like, don't show me anything with a big enough plot of land because I'll make a garden. And then I realized I was looking at places that had these little patios, and I was thinking, now I could make a terraced garden here real easy, So
yes, vertical. Go vertical.
Yeah, I'm gonna go vertical, but it's amazing how it does add dimension to your life and to your reality to have a synchronicity with these elementals, these other parts of our reality that you don't have to make best friends with them, but if you acknowledge the fact that they exist, they will co-create with you, and they will be synchronistic with you in your home and in your life. Now don't everybody go out and crumble cookies everywhere looking for the fairies, because then you're just going to get ants. But
yeah, exactly. You have to exercise some common sense with your offerings and such. But I have had a ghost cat, actually. Since I thought that was interesting that you said that, because the last place that I lived before the last place that I lived in San Francisco, I had one of the first experiences I had in that apartment. It was this attic. I mean, I always ended up somehow living in attics of old Victorians. But I had a couple of kind of things out of the corner of my eyes or whatever, stuff like that when I moved in there. I was like, I'm open, whatever. And then one night I was laying down in bed, and I just sort of drifting off to just finally falling asleep at 2 a.m, whatever. And I felt something, pressed down on the foot of the bed. And my first thought as I'm drifting off to sleep was, You just love that feeling when a cat curls up at your feet and you're in bed and they sort of like press the covers down around your feet. I just love that feeling. And I thought, oh, that's so nice. And then my next thought was, I don't have a cat. I kind of sat up, was like, and I'm alone in this apartment. There's no one else there. I didn't have a cat at the time. And I thought, okay, did that just, okay, no, okay, whatever, I must have shifted funny. So I fall back asleep and drifting back asleep again, and then what would you know it, the feeling of something pressing down. And this time it's pretty hard in a way that, just like a big old cat would be pressing down on the covers. So I'm like, okay, I sit up. Like that time I felt it, and I know I don't have a cat, and that was, that's twice in a row in like a 10-minute period. So this is definitely happening. So I just thought, okay, this is happening. I'm really tired. I need some sleep. So I go to fall asleep, and the third time it was so strong that wasn't like heavier necessarily, but it was so distinct that at that point, that's when I just sat up and I just put the light on, and I said, all right, you know what? I'm up. All right, you got me. I'm up. And then there were other things that would happen that would make me think that a cat was in the apartment. And I thought, well, I had lived with cats so much in my life, and it was one of the first times that I'd lived completely without a cat, so that I'm just having like cat PTSD or something, like thinking I'm seeing a cat, so used to being a cat. But so many little things would happen, and I never heard a meow or anything like that, but I did feel the presence of a cat numerous times. And then later, I actually moved into like the rest of the attic. So it was kind of like a front apartment. And then originally it was all one place. And I moved into the back apartment. They were separate now. And in that apartment, I had a ton of experiences. And my mom was convinced there was a cat in that apartment. I didn't have any cat-specific experiences, but I did have a number of more kind of playful, childlike experiences. And I talk about that in the Paranormal Parlor book, where I kind of got into, that was one of the first times where I really sort of sat down and thought about, like, okay, what are all of the experiences that I've had in, my conscious life of, like, what kind of paranormal things have I had happen? Because here I am writing about other people's experiences, and I felt like, oh, actually, I have had a number of things happen. So I just liked that thought of having a cat. And it wasn't a cat that I knew, and I love that it's actually a cat that you knew, and you, like, undoubtedly, you know his name.
Oh, yeah.
I find that incredibly
my
comforting.
husband.
I would hope that my cat remains with me long after.
When my husband moved in here, I said to him, there is a spirit cat here. His name is Smudge. And he said, yeah, right. And I said, just that's what the cleaning lady said. And then she saw him, and every now and then she'll say, oh, Smudge was upstairs when I was vacuuming. And we were sitting in the kitchen, and I had a lot of cats at the time. There were 12 cats in the house at that time, because he brought 3 when he moved in. And we were sitting and talking, and he suddenly looked under the table and he said, we don't have a gray cat, do we? And I said, no. And he said, huh. And a couple of minutes later, he looked under the table again, and he said, well, this gray cat got in the house, so we ought to find him and, help him out. And I said, that was Smudge. And he said, yeah, right. And the third time, he looked, and he saw Smudge, and then he saw Smudge disappear. And he said, the cat just disappeared. I said, it was Smudge. And from then on, maybe once a week or so, he would say Smudge was upstairs, or I saw Smudge in the kitchen, and most of the people who visit the house regularly know about Smudge, because he's definitely there, and he will be going with me. I happily don't have to have a carrier for him, because I think he'll just come along with everything
you don't have
else.
to battle him to get into
you
don't have to battle him to get him into the carrier.
Yeah, the other 3 may be a bit difficult.
Oh, yeah, I don't envy you that.
No.
But just kind of going back to something that you were talking about, of just these experiences and these creatures and just kind of how that can really enhance your life. I think that there's an element to storytelling that we miss out on, and we can absolutely get it when we're reading books. I mean, I'm an author, please, buy people's books and read people's books, and buy my books and read my books. I mean, I absolutely think you can get it. You could be lost in a story. But there is something very specific that happens when you are being told a story. Your mind is working in a different way when you're being told a story. And when you're being told a story, you are suspending your belief, or your disbelief, I should say, and you're suspending your doubt just long enough to sort of transform to this other place, to accept that what you're hearing could be. Even if you're going to tell yourself at the end that it was your imagination was wandering and there was this wonderful creative process happening, you're still transforming into another place. You are still sort of time traveling. You're still accepting these sort of fantastical ideas. You're accepting them, and when you're doing that, I do think something really important is happening to your brain. And I think that gives us coping tools for daily life and the things that aren't as fantastical and fun. And without that ability to sort of just think, okay, this is possible, you lose the ability to think that you can do things and that you can achieve things. And so when we move very far away from a tradition of oral storytelling, or recognizing the importance of storytelling, the importance of myths and folklore, and kind of, explaining things to people in the form of a story, and we're taking things very literally, and we're analyzing every word that's coming out, and we're missing that point, which is that kind of idea of how important it is to us as a culture to just connect in that way, to be frightened together, to laugh together. We kind of get it a little bit if we go to like a play or movies together. You can kind of have a little bit of that experience, but that storytelling, that tradition of storytelling, it's so important to that, because it really does. It actually gives you the ability to kind of actually change reality, to change your own reality, to change the world, to think I can do this now.
The announcer for the show, Ken Quiethawk, is a native storyteller. And they travel all over, and his voice is so magical. It's amazing.
His voice is fantastic. It's just so deep, and like it just instantly transports you. And that's a big part of it too, right? That when you hear someone's voice telling you, you just I would just accept anything he is saying. I was just like, okay, I'm with you. I am going down that road. I am with you, because it's it does put you in this other frame of mind, and that's so important. And I was kind of hearing what you were talking about in the very beginning about him as a storyteller, and I just think that's something that you can find in in modern culture, around the world, cross-culturally, traditional cultures, indigenous cultures, and something that is very easy for us to revive with the simple art of telling our children a bedtime story at night. I mean, that's, or even...
You just reminded me. I ran an arts and crafts fair a long time ago, and when I was looking for people to come and be vendors and stuff, I met a lady who was a professional storyteller, and they are out there. They're not as frequent as they used to be, but and it was amazing. She could gather a crowd around her in like 5 minutes and have them transfixed in 10. I mean, there are professional storytellers out there that are worth looking for them and experiencing them, because they have a mastery and a magic with words that is just amazing, and they take you to other places immediately. You know, it doesn't take it takes you hours and hours to read a book, but they can tell you a story, and in 5 minutes they've got you. And
you're there, right?
Yeah. Oh my
There's
God.
actually, in the area where my mom still lives, in the area in California where I grew up, there is a storytelling festival every year, and it's been going on since I was a kid. And it is like a 4-day festival that is all oral storytelling. And I still remember the stories. Not every single story I heard there, but going there as like an 8 or 9 year old, I still remember the stories, especially the scary ones that we were told, even in the light of day. It was so scary that we were told in the middle of the day in children's hour, and it was still scary. But it totally changed my perception of the woods around me. And I know that there are other festivals like that, and I just think it's just a wonderful, when you meet a really incredible storyteller like that, it's just there's just really nothing like it.
Oh God, no. And it's as far as I learned my family history by hearing my grandmother and my mother talk about it ad nauseum every Sunday at dinner, but it's a way of and that's another reason I'm moving, because my grandchildren are they don't know the family stories, and the only way you get them is by hearing them repeated over and over and over and over again.
It's true.
And
it's true. That's so funny, Barbara, because at some point you probably realize, like, oh, I don't, like, you're not going to hear them anymore. Like, those people aren't alive. They're not telling those stories. And you realize, oh, wait, those stories that I heard over and over again, they have so much value. And you absolutely must overrun your grandchildren with these stories. That's like,
and
that's
I
a goal.
will. It really is. You addressed another of my very favorite paranormal creatures, and because I have a love affair with vampires. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, her series of books on vampires with Saint Germain, they're actually used in history classes in some colleges because all of her historical stuff is accurate. She just has woven vampires through them. And again, another great way of teaching history, because you're following this vampire through a culture that she's describing beautifully, and you're learning about history by watching this vampire go through these different time frames in history, which is fascinating. And she goes way back, and she even covers the Civil War and I think World War I too. So it covers generations, and same vampire throughout time, which was fascinating. And the other one, of course, is Anne Rice, who did a great job with vampires as well. You even drove me to watch the Twilight series because I had not seen that. So
yeah.
So vampires.
Vampires are very.
They come from a really icky past, but you can fall in love with them just the same.
You can, and that's it's interesting because I think so I wrote the book Banshees, Werewolves, and Vampires, and one of the things that was so interesting to me were the parallels with sort of werewolves and vampires culturally, but also how strikingly different our relationship is with them. Although many, many times vampires and werewolves were targeted much in the way witches were. that that was a diagnosis or an excuse to hang someone or burn somebody. Was it that lady's a vampire, that man's a werewolf, or that woman's a werewolf. But we have such a different relationship with them. When we think of a vampire, we absolutely think of falling in love. We think of this sort of like lustiness and this draw, this sultriness
glamour
and sexiness to a vampire, very glamorous. But a werewolf, we feel sort of sorry for the werewolf. We know he doesn't mean it. we have a totally different relationship, and in many ways, and they are very, very different. But it's interesting to me because so often they have evolved along kind of similar points in history, right up into the wonderful times of sort of the campy movies and the Frankenstein vampire and wolf, or Frankenstein, Dracula and Wolfman, like the wonderful trio of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney, kind of all playing these characters, and that sort of rise of these supernatural creatures in our culture from the 50s and 60s and kind of to what we have, this relationship we have with them today. But I find
today
vampires
it's kind of
incredibly interesting.
I was just thinking, a cool book would be how to housebreak a werewolf.
How to bet a vampire? That's easy.
Yes. and not get bit.
How to keep a vampire is probably would be the tricky part. Yeah, well, and I
Definitely.
think so. It's interesting to me because I do get asked about vampires occasionally, and I have actually been accused of being a vampire, which I am not. But I know quite a bit about the modern vampire culture by nature of study and relationships that I've had, and friends that I have who identify as vampires, books and authors that I've worked with who write about vampires, and not necessarily just in a folkloric way, but in a magical way. There are a couple different magical orders of vampires who approach magic in a similar way that you might equate someone being a Wiccan. So there are certain rituals, there are certain, similar times of the year in which these rituals are practiced. There's steps that you take to become part of this organization, somewhat like you might take if you were part of an organized coven, or if you were part of, something like the OTO. So there's kind of some similarities there. And what I think is very cool about this particular group of vampires that I've kind of come to know, or I've come to know their leader, for lack of a better term, is that they're not saying, oh no, we don't like to dress like vampires. They totally love it. They love it. They embrace that. You mentioned glamour, and that they embrace that glamour. And if you think of that original kind of, that old world way of looking at glamour, that glamour and glamoury, that was magic. That was a form of magic. It was a form of flashy trickery that also sort of, created this incredible world. And that completely exists. It's a super, super subculture. It's not a huge teeming culture. There's a lot of people who would probably enjoy it or might attend a vampire ball. But there are some core people who really like to live this lifestyle. It's not unlike the way somebody might be really, really into S&M. They have this lifestyle. It doesn't mean they don't go about their daily job, doing regular things that regular people do, and you might not even know. And, with the vampires, you might be able to tell if they've had, fang implants or something like that. But the other thing that's really cool about them, and probably why you as an empath and a psychic are so attracted to them, is that I have found that every vampire I have I have met, and I've met a couple that I didn't care for too much, but that they are by nature incredibly empathic, incredibly sensitive, and to the point where in many cases it's difficult for them to function without having what they would consider to be like their donor. So that they actually are requiring the emotions and the energy of somebody else in order to kind of function in a regular fashion because they are so empathic. I know many vegetarian vampires, which people think is hilarious. Not all vampires are in it for the blood, I guess. But it's very interesting because I think that this subculture does completely embrace a lot of the things that we think of and we associate with vampires. And then, of course, you know, there's a lot of really kind of cool just tidbits about vampires. I think, like, one of the things that I learned that I thought was very interesting, the rise of the vampire in sort of literature and then modern culture, and we can thank Bram Stoker for much of this, he taps into several different kind of overarching mythologies. But, you know, there was a time when people were doing things that were far more gruesome than anything you could imagine a vampire doing. And that was early medicine. That was grave robbing. And that was, you know, stealing cadavers in order to try and find out what was really inside the human body. And during that time, grave robbing was so common, and it wasn't like the doctors would go and rob the graves, right? They would pay someone to go and get, especially if someone had died, maybe they had died young or seemingly of natural causes, or perhaps there was some kind of rumor about the way that they died because they were actually trying, it was against the law, but they were trying to find cures. They were trying to find ways of, you know, advancing medical science. So the grave robbers, who were usually, you know, poor people who were paid a few pence to go into the graves and to the crypts, a lot of these kind of fears and superstitions about vampires arose during that time, because of experiences that they had. For example, it was tradition to sort of cross when a person died, you would lay their arms, you know, across their chest. That was a way of part of dressing the body. When you think of the image of a vampire, sort of slowly think of Nosferatu, or like an early Bela Lugosi image of him sort of slowly rising up out of the coffin with his arms crossed across his chest. Well, that was rigor mortis. And they would pop open the lid of a coffin, and boing, the body would spring up. And I mean, how scary would that be? I mean, you would just like run out of there screaming vampire, and you know, never go back.
Have you watched What We Do in the Shadows?
I haven't.
Oh my!
Should I add that to my list right now?
Oh yeah. Absolutely, that is a really cool series, but you know, back to vampires, they really are, you know, they have been portrayed as negative entities, and yet, in our culture, we have been afraid of them, but there are people that literally believe they are vampires. I mean, I've seen films of a lot of these people that really believe they are vampires and have to drink human blood. And there, just a while back, there was on television there was I think she was a queen or a princess. She believed that she was the first mass murderer in whatever country this was in. She believed that if she bathed in the blood of virgins, that she would live forever.
Are you talking about Madame Bathory?
Yes.
Madame Bathory? Yes, Elizabeth Bathory. Well, I heard something really interesting about her that kind of changed my whole perspective on that, because I had heard of her and her bathing in the blood of virgins in order to stay young. And I had heard of that story, and I think I even wrote about it in the vampire book. I mean, she's a fascinating character, and also sort of fueled some of the things that Bram Stoker put in Dracula, and that some of the early vampire novels included, were these real stories of her. I mean, this was like, history, where she was supposedly she was very cruel to all of her servants, and then these young women, she would bleed them and then eventually kill them and bathe in their blood. But I heard something very interesting.
Oh, okay. What?
No. Well, this actually kind of, and it was fairly recently. I was listening to a podcast called Lore, which I really like. The guy talks about a lot of topics that I'm very interested in and that I've written about. And he was talking. I thought, oh, here's one about Matt, and I think he even corrected. I always said Bathory, but I think it's Bathory, and he says that you're all saying it wrong. It's Bathory because of the pronunciation or something. And anyway, but he doesn't come out and say this. He's more of a reporter of the facts in a folkloric way, where you're left to draw your own conclusions. So he doesn't necessarily fall on the side of the folklorist nor the side of the diehard historian. He just sort of paints this picture and includes a lot of facts. He does an excellent job of researching. I think he does a great job. So he starts talking about how she also was one of the only women of her time who actually had any power. She inherited land and a castle that was supposed to go to, some local baron, but she claimed it, much in the way, you hear the story of like Elizabeth and how it was all supposed to, she was supposed to just turn it over, get married. And so Elizabeth Bathory did not do that. And the more he talked about the history and the times, the more and more it started sounding to me like the stories of the old hags who were cursing the cows, and then they were hung as witches, and then the land baron next door got to take over the land by rights because they were his cows. And I started thinking, hang on a second, she might have been getting a bad rap all along, and they made up these horrific stories to imprison her because it was the only way to actually take hold of her. Now, she might have been very mean. She might have whipped people. I mean, she could have easily been a cruel ruler in that way. But I did start thinking, how do rumors get started? It doesn't take much. It takes one, false tweet, right? Like it doesn't take much to convince some people. And then if everybody's benefiting from this rumor, and she's imprisoned, and I think she dies in prison. So when he started talking to him, he doesn't really say that. He's just kind of describing the circumstances. But I know enough about the history of the persecution of witches and women in history to start, the gears start turning in my head. And I thought, I might have really pegged her for something that she wasn't. So I don't know her whole story. But suddenly I started thinking, we might want to reexamine how we're looking at vampires.
I think that she was, I can't remember the number, but it was in the thousands that she had killed and drained. She was found guilty, and because she was royalty, they walled her up in her castle with just a small little opening for them to pass her food, and she did. She died there eventually, but it took her a number of years, and they say she haunts the place.
It was a long, slow death. Oh, wouldn't you? I would never leave. I would torture anyone who ever darkened my doorstep again after that.
Unbelievable, though.
Yeah, her story is absolutely incredible, and she's one of the few kind of like real non-fictionalized, I guess, just historically, people associated historically with vampires. There are lots of fiction works that that where there are female vampires, but she is one of the kind of go to female characters who are associated with.
Yeah, she's right up there with Vlad the Impaler. Come on.
Right.
I mean,
and actually,
he did exist.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Vlad totally existed, and he did impale. Certainly.
A lot.
A lot. A lot of impaling.
Yeah, I wanted to touch a little bit too upon the fact that as we have come more and more into a quote unquote modern age, that a lot of the stuff has come more into the fore with the onset of spiritualism. And you got to give the Fox sisters a little bit of credit here, because they did help to make spiritualism more of a common practice, and because of them, spirituality became a recognized, strangely, church, even though it is a philosophy and not a religion, in order to protect those people who were sensitive and were talking to spirits and were able to communicate with those that had passed over.
Yes. Well, and that also, I think that holds a very interesting place in women's history as well, because spiritualism, which kind of really came to its peak during the 1840s through about the 1930s in the United States, but still exists today, was basically the belief that not just that you could talk to the dead, but that the dead actually had messages for us, and that the dead had something to teach the living. So, of course, since we could speak, we've been, since the first time we ever had a concept of loss or death, we've been trying to communicate with some kind of great beyond. So that concept isn't necessarily that new, but the idea that you could actually use tools and that there were people who could be used as conduits to communicate with the dead and then disseminate those messages to society in general and sometimes specific people, that was really the core foundation of spiritualism. And it came to a great, great rise after the Civil War, because there was so much loss and so much grief that people were really turning towards spiritualism, some out of the desperate longing to speak to and find out what happened to their loved ones, and some out of curiosity. It also coincided with a really fascinating time in history, because things like electricity and that great giant steam train that was starting to travel across the United States and the telephone, these were also becoming more common and becoming part of our culture in a way that didn't exist before. And so suddenly the phone could ring and you could pick it up and this disembodied voice was talking to you on the other end. And this was a telephone, or, the early ways of communicating via telegram. And so those kinds of things were happening at the same time that the spiritualist movement was moving forward, advances in photography. And so there were things like spirit photography. Now, the Fox sisters, they did make spiritualism incredibly well known. And something that I love about the spiritualist movement is that because people who believed in spiritualism were by nature open-minded people, often people who were part of the spiritualist movements were also people who were abolitionists and suffragettes and people who were forward-thinking in terms of civil rights and women's rights. So you would have people that were, there was this wonderful couple named, I think it was Emily and Isaac, or was it Anna and Isaac? I had to look at my book, but they were the Posts. And the Posts were these well-to-do members of society who would host salons all of the time. And they would have, Frederick Douglass come and Susan B. Anthony. And they also had the Fox sisters. And the Fox sisters were these three sisters. Two of them were the, quote-unquote, the act, and one of them was sort of the management. And their whole thing was that they could communicate with the dead. They would hold seances, and they would also put on shows. And it was usually through parlor games. It was a form of rapping. So knock once for yes, knock 3 times for no. Is there somebody in this room? Kind of when we think of like your quintessential seance, so many of those things the Fox sisters were bringing to an everyday. Now, unfortunately, they also like to drink, and so what the rumor is, what brought them down is that the one Fox sister, so the one who was the manager, who wasn't really part of the act, was married, and she was sort of the business manager. The other two, who were the act, with some other help, they had some family members, some cousins and such, they made so much money. They traveled the United States. And just getting back to the way that the spiritualist movement kind of also coincided with women's history, this was a time when women in the Victorian era, there weren't a lot of options for women, right? It was like you could live a life of servitude. If you were married, you could live a life of servitude of one kind, or you could remain unmarried and live a life of servitude of another kind. There's a lot of servitude happening. You could serve God, you could serve drinks, or you could serve your husband. Like those were kind of like, here's your choices, ladies. Or you went and you got a career like maybe teaching, but you just did that until you got married. So there weren't like a lot of ways for women to really express themselves. And the spiritualist movement handed that to women in many, many ways. You had women who were channeling poetry and becoming poet laureates of the United States. You had women who were channeling novels and basically going on shows. And even like the Fox sisters, they were a traveling show, almost on the edge of being like a circus performer. But they had more credibility and more respectability. And you weren't an actor writing in a sideshow. You were this person who was well respected and thought to possess a power that other people didn't have, a power that in Victorian era America was reserved for men of a certain class. So this was very revolutionary in terms of what was happening in the United States and the shift of thought in politics. Now the Fox sisters, like I said, they actually were the two sisters were drunks. And one of them allegedly took a payout from a newspaper and got about $1,000 to say that the whole thing was fake. And then a cousin got $500 from the same newspaper to back up that story. Well, she tried to recant it later and say, no, actually it's all real. But she had gotten in a spat with her sister, and in the end, it kind of just brought their whole empire down. And they had quite an empire. No one believed them. And from that, moment forward, it was all kind of seen as this act of charlatans. And it actually did a lot of damage to, the more legitimate members of the spiritualist movement. And then those two actually died totally penniless. And, I think one of them died of alcoholism. So you also had people who were doing magic and mentalism, like Houdini and his early contemporaries, who actually were sort of setting out to disprove spiritualism as much as possible. Not that he was a disbeliever, not that Houdini did not believe in the psychic arts and psychic ability, but he could spot an illusion a mile away. So he had sort of this mission where he was trying to disprove a lot of like what the Fox sisters were doing or similar things in order to let people know that those were parlor tricks and that they're, what was legitimate was completely, something completely different. So there were a lot of kind of warring. It was like a sort of warring magicians, I guess, in a way. It was a pretty fantastical time.
Well, there have always been people that have, disbelieved, and along with the people who have believed. So, it's a matter of faith. Sometimes you can't, there's no scientific way of proving something other than demonstrating, and then when you demonstrate, people will always find ways of saying, well, you knew that before or something like that. But tell the story about Mark Twain and the typewriter, because that's a cool story.
Oh, that is like the best story. That story is the story that made me write the Paranormal Parlor book, because it's a story that I had been carrying around. I had learned about a number of years ago, and I really just sort of carried it around because it was just the most incredible story. So I stumbled upon this story trying to find some old writing just about seances. I think I was actually just looking in the Gutenberg archives, in the Gutenberg library online, and I was just typing in words like I would type in Ouija board or seance. I think I actually typed in Ouija board because it's all really early stuff, like it's all public domain, so it was all pre-1920. And just, well, what's going to pop up? And this thing pops up that says, a novel written via the Ouija board. And I think, what on earth? So it's this story, and it's called Jap Huron. So I went on to read the introduction, and then I went on to research more about the woman who wrote it and the times in which it was written. So it was written by a woman named Emily Grant Hutchings, and what she talks about in the introduction is that this novel was actually written after Mark Twain's death by his ghost. So Samuel Clemens came to her at a seance and said, you are the one, you are my scribe. Actually, he communicated via a medium, and he had been looking for a scribe. And the story is that when Emily walked into the room, he said, that's the one. And this medium, Mrs. Hutchings and Mr. Hutchings, over the course of about a year and a half, painstakingly transcribed from the Ouija board an entire novel, supposedly from the ghost of Samuel Clemens. And the best part about the whole story, I read the novel a number of times. It's definitely got Twain-like elements. I don't think he's the hardest person on earth to replicate if you've studied him enough. Would love to have somebody who's a real Twain scholar really dig into it and pull it apart. But I was much more interested in the provenance of the story and the way that she told the story of the story. She talks about taking this Ouija board, this spirit board, and putting on parentheses and semicolons, because Samuel Clemens is getting tired of her mistaking his parenthetical statements for part of the sentence that he wants in the novel. Like, he's saying things to her as an aside, but he can't find the parentheses because there's no parentheses mark. So he's running all around the board, pushing the planchet so it says that was parenthetical. So they come up with all of these basically keyboard shortcuts for the Ouija board, and it's like amazing. It's just amazing, and the way she's just describing this. So we don't know. What happened is they put the novel out, and it's pretty cool because Emily Grant Hutchings actually was really good friends with Patience Worth. Patience Worth was the woman who became her novels became very widely loved, and she was considered to be like the poet laureate. Well, Patience Worth and Emily Grant Hutchings were friends, and they both kind of attended a few of the same seances in the St. Louis area, a couple of St. Louis housewives there, dabbling in the psychic arts. And her friend, has shot to fame. Now, Emily hasn't had that degree of success in her regular journalist career, and now she goes on, she finds a publisher for this incredible novel that she's worked on, and it goes to press, it actually is printed, and Samuel Clemens' daughter and his publisher actually owns the name Mark Twain still, and Samuel Clemens' daughter owns the royalties and the estate of Mark Twain. They find out about this book, and they basically send a cease and desist to the publisher, and he has to destroy all the books, which is why most of us will never see an actual physical copy of this book. They have to destroy the books. It actually goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, this lawsuit. And in the end, the book has to be destroyed. And really, it kind of comes down to the fact that she said Mark Twain. If she had said in the subtitle, if she had said Samuel Clemens, if she had said, because Mark Twain was copyrighted, so it actually became a copyright issue more than even did she actually channel his ghost. They weren't concerned with proving whether or not the actual experience had happened. It was the fact that she didn't have the right to publish under the name Mark Twain. That's kind of how the whole thing ended up in the Supreme Court and got thrown out of court. And if you look and you dig deep enough in the way back machine of the internet, you'll find the occasional mention of a trial that involved the Ouija board that went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1916, and that's the trial. It's this trial of whoever his publisher was, one of the big publishing houses, versus Emily Grant Hutchings. And she's saying, but I channeled this. This is not, this is original work. And they're saying that's not the issue. You can't publish under Mark Twain. So
did she publish under her own name?
Well, it says it's by Emily Grant Hutchings. The book actually, it doesn't say it's by Mark Twain, but in the title, it says Jap Her Own, a novel by Mark Twain via Ouija or something like that in the original book. So now today what we would do is we would just take that down, take out his name, change a few things in the book, and then put it back out there, right? But at that point, I think it was completely defeated. And to my knowledge, she never wrote another novel. She was sort of an amateur. But there's more to the story. And I got into it a little bit, but personally, I think this could be an entire, you could dedicate an entire book, an entire research project, because there's actual evidence that there was correspondence between Mark Twain and Emily Grant Hutchings, and they may have even met in San Francisco during sort of the World's Fair time when he was going about, and it was common for people to, go to these sort of literary visits or take classes or lectures or whatever. And there are some letters where so one person had written an article about this years ago saying that she wrote to him and he sort of jilted her and was just kind of like, find your own voice. And that was evident, that was enough for her to sort of, write this book out of vengeance, which I dismissed that idea immediately because I thought, well, sure, there you go again, just saying some woman's vengeful and that is not actually qualified. She's just vengeful, and that's why she did it. So I kind of dismissed that as her motivation, although I didn't dismiss the idea that they had met and that there was, correspondence between them, and that she was an aspiring journalist and quite looked up to him. There's so many deeper layers to the story when you kind of start peeling it away, and it's all quite fascinating. But it does also just kind of speak to the times, at a time when, women could become famous and respected for something other than the what was expected of them, during a time when that was very, very rare. And the psychic arts did give women a lot of freedom that they would not have had otherwise. And many women went on to build other careers on top of that. There was also an incredible woman named Ida Craddock, who was actually, she's got an amazing story. And there is an entire book about her. There's a couple of books about her. One is called, I think it's called Idocratic Sexual Outlaw Spiritual. I can't remember, but it's by a man named Veer Chappell, and it's a great book, and it talks about Idocratic was arrested for the distribution of lewd materials. And what she was doing is she was sending out letters in the mail. She'd advertise in the back of a paper, for $1, send to this address, and I will send you what to expect on your wedding night. And women, this was in the mid 1800s, women would send their little dollars secretly away, and they would get this unmarked package, and this unmarked package would be this very proper, but kind of like, this is what to expect. It wasn't really, detailed sex education, like this is going to this is going to be insert A into slot B or whatever. It wasn't like that, but it was like, here's what to expect. Here's how to behave. And also she talked also about sort of like the spiritual union of, the bride and the groom on their wedding night. This was outrageous to many people who weren't used to seeing women's ankles, mind you. So this was considered absolutely outrageous. And she was persecuted by Anthony Comstock in his Society for the Suppression of Moral Vice, and persecuted for years. Now, mind you, she was only in her 30s when she died. So for more than, I think, 10 years, he persecuted her and tried again and again and again to have her arrested and to catch her. And eventually he was able to have her arrested for the distribution of lewd materials, and her sentence was to be institutionalized. Now, he was a very wealthy man with a lot of money, and he just had it out for her. She, instead of going to a life in a institution, took her own life, and she left 2 letters, one to her mother saying why she had done it and that she loved her mother and what a good mother she had been, and the other letter was to Anthony Comstock. It is like the biggest FU in history. I mean, it is great. It is just this great letter, like, not only were you wrong, but you won't live to see how wrong you were. It's wonderful. But it's a very sad story, but it's a very interesting time. And she kind of comes into the spiritualist movement because she actually claimed to get all of her knowledge from her spirit husband. She was married to an angelic being who visited her at night and gave her all this knowledge that she could then impart to other young ladies of the time. And she herself was not actually married. She never admitted to having sexual relationships with any men, although there's a lot of speculation that that's where she actually got her knowledge. But she was so detailed in her descriptions of the angelic order of beings and the knowledge that he gave her, not just about the marriage bed, but about other greater spiritual things, that Aleister Crowley made her an honorary member. He was so impressed with what she wrote. He reviewed some of her writings in his Equinox publication, and then he actually made her an honorary member of the OTO, a fairly high, I forget what her ranking was, because he was so impressed with her knowledge that he knew she had to have gotten that from a legitimate source. So she did have some, and today is known more for that than for her early sex education, but it's all intertwined. And I highly recommend that book by Veer Chappell. He really illustrates the times and what she went through. And I touch on her a little bit in my Paranormal Parlor book, but I worked with Veer on that book a bit, and so I got very inspired by that story and had to include it in with this collection of these other women who were very instrumental in the spiritualist movement.
Yeah, it's a movement that is still moving. And
it's still moving, yeah. Good point.
Yeah, it hasn't stopped moving yet. But it's come a long way. The one other woman that that has a story connected to her is the widow of the Winchester fortune, and her building her house of so long as she kept building the ghost
everything in 13s.
Yes.
Yes, and
amazing.
she also was very interested in the psychic arts and would frequently hold seances, and actually had a room that had 13 windows. That was her sort of her own paranormal parlor. But another very interesting thing about her is that she had this huge amount of land and lots of money, and she was a little bit of a recluse. So she had like very large shrubs and things kind of planted around her estate. Well, people were nosy, and they were constantly kind of showing up at her door and trying to, peek in and look in at the construction. And so a lot of rumors came out of the fact that she actually was sort of a person who liked to keep to herself. She had minimal staff. She was very close with her gardener and sort of the one person that had stayed with her at her house all those years, but especially after she lost her baby. And I went to the Winchester house, and the kind of crazy thing, they took us on this tour, and you end up in this room where there's a safe. I'll see if I can get this right too, because it's kind of amazing. So there's this safe. So after she died, so after she dies, there's a safe left behind, and no one has ever been allowed to look in this safe. And here's a woman who is heir to the Winchester rifle empire. Her husband had passed away. She had more money than she could ever spend. I mean, she was constantly building. Some people say she was just trying to spend all the money, and she could never spend the money. So they pop open this safe after her death, and what's in it is a letter and a lock of her baby's hair, and that's it. There's no gold coins. There's no antique rifles. There's no, emeralds and rubies and pearls spilling out of it. There's a lock of hair and a letter. So it kind of shows you what she actually held in value, and that she was a little bit of the victim of her circumstance, again, being a widow who didn't want to go on and remarry, who had all of this money, who had a lot of power, and everybody just thought she was like this weird person. And she definitely was odd. I mean, she was building a very odd house, but she had a lot, there were a lot of layers to that beyond just her feeling that she was haunted. But that's a lot of people say that she was. Oh, and when I was at the Winchester house, I had my son with me, and he was very, very young. And so he was probably about 3 or 4 years old, totally inappropriate tour for him, totally inappropriate. It was getting dark. It was great. It was just like, yes, we're looking at all these spooky things. We got this like night VIP tour, and he had to go to the bathroom. So someone I was with said, well, I'll take him to the bathroom. So he takes him to the bathroom, and then they have some trouble catching up with us. And later he says to me, were you guys waiting outside the bathroom? No, we weren't. And so he said, well, somebody was like, I heard steps, and they walked up outside the bathroom. And so distinctively that when we opened the door, I just assumed someone else had followed us and was waiting to go in the bathroom too. And when we told the guide that, he was like, oh, that's so-and-so, and described some, I forget who it was, George or something, some ghost that frequently would follow guests around when they got off the path to kind of make sure that they weren't snooping, is what he said. It was like the butler's ghost or something. So, yeah, so cool. That's my Winchester story.
We're down to about a minute, so if you want to give people your website and stuff like that so they can find you, I think this is a good time to do that.
Okay. So it's varlaventura.net, my name.net, couple of V's there. Also, same name. You'll find me on Facebook and Twitter and all of those things. And all of my books, I have links to them on my website. You can find them anywhere books are sold. They're all in print. And yeah, I that's about all I got right now. I'm working on another book. It probably won't be ready for quite some time. I'll drop some hints on the internet about it as it shapes up.
I highly recommend the ones that you had out there because they're absolutely fabulous.
Well, that's high praise indeed coming from you, Barbara, and I really, really appreciate that you took the time to read them, and I really appreciate you having me on again. It's been a delight.
Oh, well, was